Welcome back to Domino Theory, the podcast about media, politics, and business. I'm Christian Whiton, joined as always by co-host Mark Simon. I'm coming to you today from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Mark is in Florida today, and our guest Steve Yates joins us from Buenos Aires. Mark and Steve, please say hello.
Hi there. Great to be with you.
All right. Well, another fun week in Washington coming to an end. This one had the non-State of the Union, State of the Union. So that's the first address the president gives in his new term. You don't call it the State of the Union, I guess, because he hasn't been president long enough to really opine on the State of the Union, but opine away Trump did. And he packed enough information into that hearing that I think it's probably more content rich than any State of the Union, at least anyone that I can remember. Certainly went on for a long time, 2 hours. And a lot of people are focused, of course, on the macro politics, whether Trump is winning, how he's doing with popular support, what Doge is accomplishing, what the Democrats refuse to stand up for, including a 13-year-old cancer survivor, and sort of the big politics. I'd like to jump into an area that I think is just below the surface, that does have a lot of policy activity, but we're not seeing it because there's so much going on in Ukraine, and there's so much going on with eliminating DEI, and there's so much going on domestically, but that's East Asia. And Trump actually has put not insignificant tariffs on China, and this is on top of tariffs that both he and President Biden had on China to start off with, 20%, and the prospect that those tariffs may be going higher. You have a government there with Xi Jinping that, unlike Canada and unlike Mexico and unlike others who have been threatened with tariffs, actually isn't backing down, perhaps because his political system doesn't let him back down. And we also had this week a hearing on the Hill. It didn't get too much in terms of headlines, but significant nonetheless. It was for the Undersecretary of Defense for Political Affairs. The nominee is Bridge Colby. A lot of talk about Taiwan. Of course, both of you have extensive experience with business and policy in Taiwan. But one quote that came out of it, this is from Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, and they're talking about how Taiwan has said it's going to increase its defense spending, but has a legislative yuan, its legislative branch, that's actually cut its defense budget, which can't sit well with Donald Trump. And here's what Sullivan said to Bridge. He said, okay, good. Let me go back to Taiwan very briefly. I would agree, and you talked about it earlier, it is the KMT, and it is the KMT, by the way. They control the legislature. It's different from the president's party. They're playing a dangerous game on their defense budget. And if anyone from Taiwan is watching this hearing, they need to realize they are playing a dangerous game, okay? Cutting defense spending right now is not the right signal. We all agree on that. So, Steve, with that preface, do you think, would you agree with what I'm saying, that Asia policy, even though it isn't getting headlines, is going to change dramatically, and Trump is going to approach this very, very differently than his predecessor, and very differently than, frankly, they did in the first Trump administration?
Well, definitely there are some adjustments coming. Now, some of them were foreshadowed in Trump 1.0. And it's hard to say what was done during the Biden administration because the president himself did almost nothing. There were some statements. And when it came to Taiwan, President Biden was famous for spouting off about an unequivocal commitment to defend Taiwan if it were attacked. And every single time, usually to the Financial Times, a senior White House official would walk back that statement into the warm, trodden phrases that go back to the 70s. And all that's kind of familiar territory, but really it was kind of a treading water period. And the Biden administration was filled with people who made a name for themselves talking about a pivot to Asia in the Obama administration under Secretary Clinton. And, a decade and a half later, that hadn't really materialized in a fundamental way. But they would occasionally say the right things to the right people, and meetings would be fine. And when you're dealing foreign ministry to State Department, a meeting is the objective. And so they had a fair amount of that in the Biden administration. The Trump administration isn't even in place yet, really, in a meaningful way to manage relations with Asia. You don't have the top tier ambassadors in place. You don't have an assistant secretary of state in place or an undersecretary of state for policy yet confirmed. And so you don't have some of those kind of key nodes that are active and doing things. But there's been some big things on Asia. I would argue the two most important visits to the White House so far were Japan and India. Yes, there have been others, and other topics have been covered. And who could ever forget Vladimir Zelensky coming? That tended to make a little bit of news and notice and policy. But really, the Japan visit and India visit were early, were very substantial in the broad range of issues covered. And for the bare bones staffing in the White House and across agencies, a lot of that stuff was hammered out. It almost makes you wonder whether we should have all these other people working in the government that lard up these statements over time. But I guess if you focus on the Taiwan part that you were framing, there are a couple of pieces of this that are at play at the same time. Number one is the argument that's frequently attributed to Bridge Colby, and I think he may have said some of the things along these lines in the hearing, where Taiwan needs to increase its defense spending to a substantially high percentage, and that there would be a notion of rebalancing America's forces so that there was a concentration in Asia, and that's why allies in other regions needed to increase their share of burdens so that America could concentrate elsewhere for the challenge of China. And then you had Sullivan emphasizing, well, there is divided politics in Taiwan, and we've seen this movie before. We lived through it in the Bush administration, and 20 years later, there's this push for military purchases and a divided government where the DPP is in the presidential office and the KMT controls the legislature. All that's useful. The part that didn't come out in that hearing that is also very critical is that the United States itself is very far behind in delivering things that have already been committed to and already been paid for, years behind. And so while there's, I think, an element of truth in all three sides of this, the Sullivan point, really important to put the rubber on the road in Taiwan where the obstruction is. That was different. It hasn't been often done. Very important that Taiwan does more, but in some ways it's been inching at least in the right direction, but no focus on the role that Bridge and others of the Pentagon have to play together with DOGE to make it so that America goes back to manufacturing things on time and at cost and actually deliver them to paying allies so that they deter things themselves and America doesn't have to come in to intervene. That's the part that was missing to me in that exchange. 2 parts good, 1 part AWOL.
Right.
You know, in Taiwan, nobody really trusts Colby. In Asia, the Japanese aren't not even too crazy about him. I can say that up front. They view his views on Ukraine, that once Ukraine's solved, he will just transfer those views over to Asia. The belief that they have is, from a lot of people out there, is that essentially he says this because that's what he thinks the MAGA base wants to hear. In other words, it's not very principled is the idea. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. I've only met the guy once or twice, never had a substantial conversation with him. I think a lot of the things that he said were self-evident, though. In other words, I think one of the things I really like about Trump is he's kind of the guy who's kicking the kid out of the house. You know what I'm saying? It's like, launch when ready. And, magically what's happening is people are waking up. The problem with the Taiwanese is they're not waking up in many ways. In other words, they really are consumed internally. And they're doing everything they can, in my mind, at times to move around, to just play around it. Now, I know there's some excellent people over there. The majority are pretty good. But, for example, it is a KMT issue. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you've heard of him, Steve, Fu Kunchi, the legislative whip over there. This guy's a gangster. He's a KMT guy. He spends so much time in China. And really, the Biden administration refused to call him out. I had a very animated discussion with the State Department person. Well, why are you treating these guys normally? In other words, if this guy was from Mexico, we would not have him into the White House. But magically, our AIT under the Biden administration was courting these people. And I firmly believe, after being around the KMT, knowing them, playing poker with a few of their people, the fact of the matter is, I think that they are firmly in the Chinese camp. Feel free to disagree with me. I think that's where they see their bread being buttered. And I think there's no downside for it. So I think it's going to be the problem they have is you now have a Trump, and in fairness to Elbridge Colby, I think he called him out. The other thing, too, I agree with Steve on, look, the Americans, it's a very strong comeback they have to the U.S. that you haven't delivered these weapons. I think the funniest thing I find out about that is that essentially who didn't deliver the weapons, and I think Trump will deliver weapons much more forcefully. I think it'll be much faster. It's one of my disagreements with the Ukrainians. I know it's lovely to have the Ukrainians all the stuff they want in some world, but the fact is we need HIMARS in Taiwan, we need them in the Philippines, and I would say our economic interest and our national security interest in Asia outweigh anything in Ukraine by a mile. And I think really when we look at Taiwan, Kristen, my one thing is then it always comes down to this. I'm hoping we can get somebody that they send over there for AIT who's going to speak more bluntly to the Taiwanese. And I hope somebody in this administration is much more blunt with them in the terms and more public with the Taiwanese people about what make your choice. Make your choice about what you're going to do. I think the Taiwanese are have really picked it up in the last few years, and I think the one place that's really impressed me when it comes to Taiwan is Japan. I'm 100% sold that the Japanese fight, largely because I don't think any Chinese military commander is going to leave those Southern Kuril Islands. Oh, I forget the name. Those two military bases and Okinawa. Who's going to leave those untested? There's no way. So we're in my mind. Chinese attack. Who's kidding who? We're in.
Well, Steve, what do you think about that? I guess the political scenario before the military one, because I do wonder if the Chinese would try and construct some sort of attack very carefully so it doesn't draw in Japan or hit our bases at Okinawa and present us something where we'd have to respond, at least in some part. But what Bridge, I think, was getting at, which upset some senators, at least in advance. I think I don't think he'll have a problem. I could be wrong. We'll see how the vote comes out. But the hearings seem to go fine. But the idea that finally, even though Obama said we were doing this with a rebalancing, which followed a pivot to Asia, which didn't actually happen, and then that was sort of the de facto policy under Trump and Biden. But the idea that you're going to pull back on Europe and you're going to pull back on Middle East backwaters and you're certainly going to pull back on nation building. And the idea is then you can actually constitute a military that's better prepared. And that seemed to come across from senators of both parties, this acknowledgement that we're not ready for a fight and that in fact is encouraging aggression against Taiwan.